I'm here to provide my analysis of the game I Am Bread, which was released back in April 2015 by Bosa Studios. The genre of the game is a physics-based puzzle simulation platforming kind of game, while the premise of the game is that players are in control of a slice of bread, which has the goal of becoming toast by navigating or honestly flopping around a kitchen/household environment and then reaching a toaster or any type of heat source, to be honest, while also avoiding hazards such as water or dirt that are laid out within the environment. The narrative behind the game has a somewhat absurd contrast with the goofy/humorous genre of the game, where the narrative is somewhat dark humor, honestly, as the story primarily follows the human background character Merton, where his mental state steadily declines throughout the progression of the game as he struggles to deal or contemplate the many strange things that happen around his house, as things are damaged or moved without any explanation. These, of course, being the player's actions as they navigate to the toaster or heat source. The general gameplay of the game is an interesting mix of humor and honestly frustration and anger, as the controls of the game are intentionally awkward to navigate and use initially. And in addition to these controls, there are physics based challenges incorporated within the game that provide a challenge and honestly frustration, but also are satisfying when the player is able to succeed at these, but most of the time basically failing to succeed at these to get to the next furniture or level selection or level section to progress. Knowing this, I decided to select basically just the first level, but also just some level areas or sections that demonstrate certain things that I wanted to show, such as like problem solving or such. And I also just wanted a quick understanding on the game's controls, figuring out how to use these controls to reach the final goal. And I also believed that when you are first learning the controls is roughly the most important part to this game, as after you learn the controls, everything relatively gets easier, but the first learning curve is probably really hard. The framework I've selected to analyze this game is the MDA framework, and I am examining this game as it has a direct relation with the physics-based nature of the prototype that me and my group are creating. So I'm hoping to use this analysis of the game to find out what aspects of the game creates a enjoyable experience or fun time for players and how the game uses these aspects in connection with other characteristics of the game. I'll first begin with talking about mechanics section of the MDA framework, and the mechanics within a game represent the rules or actions that control how the game is played typically, and these are typically influenced by player choice and their inputs. The mechanics within the game I Am Bread focus on the player's control of the slice of bread and the physics-based movement, momentum, and how wait, what? How the player is able to interact with the surrounding environment with other systems such as edibility and grip meters. However, the core mechanics I will focus upon within the game as it relates most with our prototype are the physics-based movement, the environmental interaction, and also the implementation of momentum. I'll start with the biggest mechanic, which is the physics-based movement, which is basically the entire gameplay of I Am Bread, or at least what the entire gameplay of I Am Bread is built around or placed around. And the game like simulates quite a realistic physics environment for the slice of bread, where the player gets this sense of soft slash floppiness feeling of the object, which makes sense for a piece of bread. And this soft slash floppiness feeling adds to the weird and awkward controls, making the movement kind of wonky and imprecise. In addition to the physics surrounding the player, or player character, like the slice of bread, the physics within the rest of the game also helps contribute to creating an unpredictable and chaotic like nature of movement, basically. These include things such as gravity that act upon the player and also other movable objects within the game, and also friction between the objects and player. The impact that these physics have upon the gameplay create a constant challenge or tension, as some things that may require precision are often incredibly harder, to be honest, due to the unstable nature of the bread's movement and controls, leading to both a challenging feeling, albeit maybe somewhat a frustrating and stressful feeling, to be honest, as well as humorous moments when you're able to flip your bread onto just a counter across the entire room. Um, but also sometimes you get stuck, which is unfortunate. Due to these physics-based mechanics, ordinary tasks such as going across a countertop or traversing from one platform to another is turned into a incredibly challenging puzzle-like experience for the player, as they need to learn to account for these physics when controlling the slice of bread, minimizing or attempting to minimize the unstable and unpredictable nature of the movement. I'll now be moving on to the next focus for mechanics, which will be the implementation of momentum, where players are able to use and build momentum in conjunction with the physics elements of the game to traverse from one surface to another. Within the game I Am Bread, this can be done with gripping and releasing certain corners of the bread in an attempt to swing or flip yourself and create momentum, basically. And these swings and flips are generally uncontrolled and rather chaotic. The game seems to implement momentum by simulating inertia upon the items and objects, and this basically causes the player to think about their speed when they're attempting to swing or flip, and whether or not they will under or overshoot the intended target that they're planning to swing or flip to. This mechanic adds more complexity to the gameplay of the game, which is already established through the physics movement system, which already creates complexity, but also creates possibilities for players who are slightly more skilled or have practiced more to traverse or navigate around the map more quickly or perform more risky actions that may be more rewarding for the player or challenging tasks, such as like reaching a higher platform or something. The last mechanic I'll touch upon is the environmental interaction. This is implemented within the game by having the slice of bread being able to interact with various objects in the environment, either using them as tools to navigate or progress through the level or hazards that the player should actively avoid. An I Am Bread environment is almost basically fully interactable and manipulable, but which basically allows the player to knock over things, grab or push objects depending on their inputs. By having environmental interaction within the game I Am Bread, it adds a level of problem solving to the game basically, as players can think of creative ways to use their environment in their advantage, such as moving objects to create paths or bridges, or experiment where players can try create like using objects or finding alternative paths or alternative cooking methods rather than the toaster. These three mechanics all work together to create a challenging and somewhat chaotic experience for the player, as physics governs the majority of the game through how the bread moves or how play interacts with objects and momentum. The player can leverage these mechanics to turn environmental objects into tools or may possibly, or honestly, possibly interact with obstacles as well, or like navigate around obstacles. These mechanics create the base of the game's chaotic slash unpredictable nature and strategic gameplay. I'll move on to dynamics now. And dynamics of the MDA framework basically refer to the behavior and interactions that emerge when a player interacts with the game's mechanics. I'll talk upon three dynamics that emerge within the game, which are the mastery of controls through repetition or trial and error, problem solving, and then lastly, tension and risk management. I'll begin with mastery of controls. This emerges due to the steep learning curve of the game and the controls that are within the game, as the physics-based movement is quite difficult to start off with, as movement is tied with the control of the corners of the slice of bread and requires quite high level of timing and coordination to, well, traverse well. This often requires repeated attempts or tries to successfully pass a level, which slowly builds upon the player's skill and understanding of how the movement or physics of the game work. The effect this has upon the gameplay is that players are able to refine their control over the slice of bread and complete harder levels or get a better grading for toasting their bread. This creates a sense of accomplishment as they overcome a challenging task or obstacle, while also encourages resilience and persistence as players will initially struggle with the game's controls but get better over time as they practice more and play more levels. I'll move on to the second dynamic now, which is problem solving, like problem solving thinking or strategies. This is created through the players needing to think or engage in creative problem solving puzzles basically throughout the game environment, as players need to find a way to help them create paths or navigate or progress to a further or next section of the level. This also helps encourage players to experiment with different ways to creating paths or heat sources to finish the level, with majority of the level allowing basically objects or elements to be interacted with. Um, yeah. This impacts the gameplay of Iron Bread by encouraging players to be more explorative and discover different ways to pass the level or like traverse the level basically. And also it helps the replayability of the game as players can use these different or basically replay the same level but use a completely different method on how to pass that level or like moving around in that level. The last dynamic I will go on to is tension and risk management, and this is created through the mechanics of the edibility and grip meter, as well as the hazards and obstacles laid out around the game level slash environment. Since players must assess the risk and judge whether the risk is worth it in addition to managing their edibility and also grip meter, which adds a sense of tension as they introduce a consequence basically if the player touches a hazard or if they use their grip meter longer than the intended, which I'm pretty sure the longer you use it, the more score it gets decreased, but it's been a while since I played the game. This increases the engagement and suspense within Iron Bread as players need to be more cautious and navigate around dangerous situations. It also adds a level of strategy as players need to think more about the routes they are taking and whether it is possible with the grip meter and also managing their edibility and grip meter to get a relatively decent score. Ironbread uses the dynamics of tension, skill development, and creativity to create a progressive gameplay experience as players maintain engagement through moments of frustration and I guess anger as well, and also accomplishment, achievement, and also the mastery of skills and the game in general, basically. I'll lastly move on to the aesthetics part of the framework, and these aesthetics are more tied to the emotional response of the player and the player's experience rather than like visual aesthetics. In I Am Bread, the game's aesthetics are dictated basically by the game's humorous moments and elements, as well as the game's challenges and also the sense of exploration and discovery, as players are basically placed in a very unique role of controlling a slice of bread which must navigate around a house to be toasted. I'll touch on the humorous and somewhat absurd section first, which is created by basically placing the player through an absurd situation of controlling a slice of bread that goes on a journey to turn itself into toast. The seemingly random and honestly absurd and comedic situation helps create moments of humor throughout the game as the player navigates around the house with the awkwardly realistic physics of the floppy piece of bread and interacting with objects around the environment, which honestly most of the time leads to chaos and humorous gameplay as the player never truly knows or like truly knows what to expect would happen when they interact with these, as most of the time I literally get flung across the room. The game encourages players to embrace the silliness and chaotic situation rather than taking the game too seriously, which gives the entire game a sense of like light-hearted humor basically rather than embracing like the frustration or stressful sense. Leading on to that, I'll then talk about how the game also has frustration and a sense of challenge as a primary part of the game. As the game's movement is intentionally difficult to control and made to be awkward, this invokes frustration and tests the player's patience and skill, as all the progress you have gained could be thrown away, basically, as your piece of bread is thrown off the bench or onto the floor by a random piece of, like, plate or something. In addition to the movement, players also need to deal with the game's hazards and scoring system, which ranks players based on how well the bread is toasted and also what their edibility meter was. With players often dealing with unpredictability, causing them to either like fail or honestly fall off a bench top, reducing the edibility meter. The game was designed with creating frustration intentionally and motivates players to try overcome the difficult levels and improve on their controls of the slice of bread. The level of frustration is often balanced out by the humor of the game or satisfaction of completing a level, keeping the players engaged but not overwhelmed or not enjoying the game. The last aesthetic I will talk about is how Iron Bread uses the sense of satisfaction and mastery to keep players engaged. As players are encouraged to try multiple times after possibly failing or trying new methods of completing the level, the control of the unique corner based movement and control of the slice of bread improves, and rewards players who persist through the frustrating moments with the sense of achievement and satisfaction as they are able to successfully complete a level they previously couldn't. As a player completes the level, it's also encouraged to repeat a level to try get a better grade or higher score, and this is done by having players' skill and control of the slice of bread improve, which basically motivates players to think that they could get a better score. And this also helps the game with its replayability factor and also encourages player engagement as they are trying to improve constantly. To conclude and recap my key findings are that in I Am Bread, it takes an unconventional slash unique premise of controlling a slice of bread and creates a gameplay style which focuses mainly around its core mechanics of physics-based movement, momentum, and also its environmental interactability. These mechanics allow dynamics of mastery, problem solving, and tension and risk management to emerge, which then also creates a range of emotions from the player, such as frustration, satisfaction, and humor. Together, all these elements create a game that are both encourage the players to go through the challenges and also enjoy the comedic absurdity of the game. The main takeaways I've observed is that the game is heavily dependent on their physics based movement and also the physics engine, as the dynamics and aesthetics of the game all stem basically from the core mechanics, and basically a balance of the difficulty and satisfaction is needed to make the game a enjoyable experience for the players, as the game may be too difficult. Just if the game was too difficult, it just create a feeling of unbalance or players being reluctant to continue playing. I believe what I could take away from the game and apply to our own prototype is that adjusting our difficulty level of our game to be slightly more difficult, as I believe currently our prototype's difficulty level is not on par as what we were aiming to do with a physics-based movement type game, as currently I believe players are just able to navigate and move around relatively easy in our game compared to players that play Iron Bread or the level of difficulty in Iron Bread. Uh, Another finding I believe we can apply to our game is that the dynamic of problem solving could be utilized more within our game, as currently most interactable items that we have within our game don't really have a purpose. They're mostly just there for players to run into and move. And I believe if we could find a way to implement possible ways that players could use these objects or stuff to create like paths or like routes basically that allow them to go to like blocked off areas or secret sections of the map, such as like a plank the player is able to push over or something, would create or basically would give players more satisfaction with their problem solving ability. And that will be the end.